Sociolinguistic is a science that combines knowledge from sociology and linguistics, and it's a science that studies the relationship between language and society. When it comes to linguistics, there were three schools of thought in the 20th century. Structuralism and transformational generative grammar mostly ignored the pragmatical side of language. It was not until functionalism the language began to be conceived as a series of options available from which the speaker might choose according to the context. For example, if you're in an academic context, you might choose a more formal speech style, whereas if you're with your friends, you will choose a more informal speech style, which means that the person will choose the most appropriate linguistic behavior according to the context. In brief, sociolinguistics is linked to the linguistic school of thought through functionalism because functionalism incorporated sociological aspect into language description. An example of this is in the tenets of the systematic grammar of holidays. Language variation is an important topic in sociolinguistics. When it comes to diachronic variation in language, Yule states that the most pervasive source of language change or source of change in language seems to be the cultural transmission, taking into account that culture is basically socially acquired knowledge. Example of this is that, according to Jules, since we no longer carry swords, we no longer heard the word phone. Moreover, some changes in language can also be linked to major social changes like wars and other historical events, as for example when Norman French invaded England, and therefore the English people borrowed many words from French. Thus, the extension to which sociolinguistics help to explain linguistic change throughout time is when they are related to language variation due to external, social, or cultural variables. And they explain this linguistic variation using mostly written documentation because there is a lack of availability of data, surveys, or recordings from, for example, 300 years ago. The answer is yes. In fact, there is an academic subfield of sociolinguistics called historical sociolinguistics that is dedicated to the study of the relationship between language and society from a diachronic point of view. However, there is a bad data problem in this field, as we mentioned. Some other sociolinguistic methods cannot be used or cannot be applied to do a diachronic research because interviews, surveys, recordings from 300 years ago are not available. And therefore, the findings of many scientists think that these findings of historical sociolinguistics are only conjectures and they are not solid results or solid conclusions. Nevertheless, sociolinguistics can be used to do a diachronic research because, as a multidisciplinary science, it can rely heavily on the advancement from other sciences, and this, with all its drawbacks, enables to reconstruct early stages of language. And for example, if a sociolinguist, historical sociolinguist, wanted to do a diachronic research, they will use information from science as social and cultural history, philology, paleography, corpus linguistic, modern day sociolinguistics, sociology, social psychology, and they will use this information from this science to do the research. According to Jules, sociolinguistics is related to anthropology through the study of language and culture, with sociology through the investigation of the role language plays in the organization of social groups, and also is related to social psychology with regards of how attitudes and perceptions are expressed and how groups' behaviors are identified. For example, anthropology could study how or what is the meaning of marriage in a small village in India, taking into account laws, local gender norms, religion, among others. Sociology could study the group itself, if there are, for example, inside this group, social class. Social psychologists will analyze how religion can affect the behavior of this group, for example. And sociolinguistics will analyze how all these aspects we mentioned before can affect language and how these create variations and how is their dialect because of that. There are two, productivity and cultural transmission. Productivity implies that humans are constantly creating new expressions and new utterances, and in fact, language is developing daily as a result of the accumulation of new words that come from the standard or non-standard variety of language. Sociolinguistic factors of language change are regularly introducing innovation into the vocabulary of a language. Sociolinguistics can address this by, for example, drawing isoglossals to determine which social group is using these new words and in which context or how. And sociolinguistics could also address the property of cultural transmission, which means cultural transmission that we do not inherit language but we acquire it. And as we mentioned before, this property is a source of language variation throughout time. For example, if we consider that different generations have different way of speaking, sociolinguistics can address then that even if a generation acquired language from the one that came before, in that process of acquisition, variations in language occurred. Several European languages have two words to talk about language. French has language and langue. Language is used to refer to language in general, and the word langue is applied to a particular language. Sociolinguistics is more suited for the concept of langue because it studies how within the same language there can be, due to social, cultural, or geographical factors, variations in language. Therefore, it studies synchronic variation in a specific language. For example, English is a particular language and sociolinguistics studies the variation with this particular language, as for example, African American English that is a dialect within this particular language. The definition of language that I believe to be the most sociolinguistic is the one from Blush and Trager from 1942. A language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which a social group cooperates. And the reason why I believe this is the most sociolinguistic is because this definition emphasizes the social function of language as a means of communication within a social group. And when it comes to sociolinguistics, it studies speech communities that are basically social groups who share a set of norms and expectations regarding the use of language. And for example, there is the North American South. In the North American South, there are many different southern accents that are used by social groups to communicate. They are all aspects of the same phenomenon. But first of all, let's consider what these concepts mean. What do they all have in common? They are all aspects of language variation. Sociolect is variation depending on the particular social class in which a person belongs. Idiolect is a personal variation in language. Diglossia is having or being able to use two distinct varieties of language and using one for everyday affairs and the other one for important matters. And lastly, bilingualism is speaking one language but learning another in order to take part in the dominant linguistic community, because as Yule explains, regional variation can involve two or more quite distinct and different languages. Thanks.